In the quiet hush before sunrise, the town of Stamps, Arkansas lay wrapped in a blanket of deep indigo. A single light flickered inside the William Johnson General Merchandise Store, a modest wooden building on the unpaved main road. Inside, the air smelled of freshly milled cornmeal, molasses, and the faint sweetness of ripe bananas. The pine floorboards, worn smooth by countless footsteps, creaked softly as a small girl stirred in her bed in the back room. Her name was Marguerite, though everyone called her Maya, and she was just 7 years old. Outside, a rooster crowed, breaking the stillness, and soon the store would come alive with the gentle murmur of the morning. The store was a world unto itself. Tall shelves held glass jars of peppermint sticks, tins of sardines, and bolts of simple cotton cloth. A large wheel of yellow cheese sat on the counter under a wire dome, and a barrel of dill pickles exhaled a sharp, briny tang. Near the door stood a pot-bellied stove, its iron surface warm even in the summer, where the old men of the neighborhood would gather later to swap stories. Outside the wide front windows, beyond the dusty road, endless fields of cotton shimmered under the first pink brushstrokes of dawn. A freight train's whistle echoed in the distance, a long, lonesome note that traveled through the flat Arkansas bottomland. Maya shared this life with her older brother, Bailey, who was her champion and closest friend. In the morning light that slipped through the slatted wooden windows, dust motes danced around their heads like tiny stars. Together they would trace letters on the flour sacks, sounding out words as if they were charms. Bailey could make her laugh even when the heavy Arkansas heat pressed down, and he defended her fiercely from any slight. Their grandmother, whom they called Mama, moved through the store with quiet authority. Her large brown hands were capable and gentle. She wore long, neat dresses and a calm expression that seemed to say this place would always be a shelter for them both. Outside, the small town of Stamps breathed at a different pace. The main street was a red dirt ribbon lined with clapboard churches, a blacksmith's forge, and a few sagging houses. Cotton fields stretched to the far horizon, so vast and white in picking season that they looked like a fall of snow under the relentless sun. Children walked barefoot to the one-room schoolhouse, carrying lunch pails, their voices like sparrows. In the distance, mules pulled wagons, their harness bells jingling with a soft, sleepy rhythm. The Arkansas sky was high and pale, and the air smelled of honeysuckle and turned earth. Life here was unhurried, measured by the rising and setting of the sun, and within that gentle orbit, the store stood as a steady heartbeat. For the Black community of Stamps, the store was more than a place to buy sugar and thread. It was a gathering ground, a sanctuary from the harshness that lay beyond the town's edge. Mama had built this refuge with her own hands, and she commanded respect with a look. She traded goods on credit during lean times, offering a dignity that the outside world so often denied. In the afternoons, the pot-bellied stove would be circled by farmers, their overalls still dusty, voices low and melodic. Young Maya would sit beneath the counter, unseen, absorbing the music of their storytelling, learning how language could stitch a community together like a warm quilt. As dusk fell, a quiet transformation took place. The store windows blazed briefly with orange light before the kerosene lamps were lit. Mama and the children would sit on the front porch, looking out at the darkened cotton rows. Crickets began their nightly chorus, and the fragrance of night-blooming jasmine drifted from a nearby yard. Maya leaned against a wooden post, listening to the grown UPS soft conversation, the murmur of voices blending with the whir of cicadas. The evening breeze carried the faint smell of wood smoke and the low croak of bullfrogs from the bayou. The stars emerged, countless and bright, scattered across the ink-blue sky like spilled sugar. In that peace, the world felt immense but kind, a lullaby of earth and heaven. Inside the store, after the porch had emptied, Maya would curl up with a book in the pool of light cast by an oil lamp. The pages smelled of dust and ink, and her small finger traced each word as she sounded it out. The sounds became meaning, and meaning opened doors. She read about faraway cities and great heroes, about rivers that flowed to the sea, and her imagination took flight. The crickets outside seemed to quiet their song in deference, as if the world itself paused to listen. In those solitary hours, she discovered that words could carry her beyond the fields of Arkansas, that language was a secret path to freedom. She read until her eyes grew heavy, until the lamp wick sputtered low, and the only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the shelf. Late at night, the store settled into a deep quiet. The long counter was wiped clean, the jars neatly aligned, the stove grown cold. Mama's footsteps had faded, and the children lay in their narrow beds under patchwork quilts. A sliver of moonlight slid through the window, tracing silver lines on the wooden floor. The building seemed to breathe, holding within its walls the echoes of laughter, the hum of prayers, and the dreams of a little girl who was just learning to listen. The scent of fresh bread rising from the kitchen sent a gentle message of comfort. In that stillness, the promise of a new dawn already stirred beneath the horizon, and the soul of the store remained a warm, protective embrace. In the years that followed, a shadow fell across Maya's young life. She and Bailey had been sent to live with their mother in St. Louis for a time, and something painful happened there, a wound so deep that Maya sealed her voice away. When she returned to the store in Stamps, she walked silently, a ghost among the sacks of flour, though her grandmother's steady kindness tried to reach her. The world around her continued its gentle rhythm. The trains still whistled, the cotton still bloomed, but Maya carried a hush within her that no morning brightness could penetrate. She did not speak for almost 5 years. Her silence was not emptiness, it was a heavy coat she wore for protection. During those quiet years, books became her most faithful companions. A small public library stood a short walk from the store, a modest brick building with worn stone steps and a single reading room. Maya would spend hours there, pulling volumes from the shelves and letting the dusty smell of old paper fill her senses. She read everything she could find, the sonnets of Shakespeare, the fiery sermons of Dunbar, the rhythms of Dickens. The librarian, a quiet woman who seemed to understand her need for solitude, never pressed her to speak. Instead, she simply guided young Maya to the poetry section, where words waited like patient friends. Sunlight streamed through the high, arched windows of the library, illuminating motes of dust that drifted lazily through the air. Outside, the afternoon heat shimmered on the red dirt street, but inside there was coolness and calm. Maya would sit in a corner by the biography shelf, her back against the warm bricks, and lose herself in the lives of others. She traced the words with her finger, mouthing them silently, letting them soak into her skin like rain into dry earth. She traveled to Victorian London with Jane Eyre, marched with abolitionists, sailed with explorers. Each page turned was a heartbeat, each chapter a small breath. In this quiet, she discovered that worlds could be built without sound. One afternoon, a woman named Mrs. Bertha Flowers invited Maya to her home. Mrs. Flowers was someone special in the black neighborhood of Stamps, graceful, educated, and calm as still water. She lived in a white frame house with a wide, shaded veranda and a garden full of roses and sweet william. Mrs. Flowers offered tea and lemon cookies, but more importantly, she offered her voice. She told Maya that language is the music of the human soul, that words carry the weight of what it means to be alive. Maya sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, and listened as the older woman's rich voice filled the room like a gentle, healing melody. In the parlor, the afternoon light filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the polished floor. A neat row of books stood inside a glass-fronted cabinet, and a large, old-fashioned phonograph sat in the corner. Mrs. Flowers selected a book. It was A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, and she began to read aloud. The words soared and dipped, filling the air with the crash of French Revolution and the tenderness of deep love. Maya watched Mrs. Flowers's face, the way her lips shaped each syllable, and for the first time in years, she felt a stirring inside her, a small flame of recognition that language could be a living thing. After the reading, Mrs. Flowers handed Maya a slim volume of poetry by County Cullen and spoke words that the girl would carry for the rest of her life. She said that no one could truly be alone as long as there were books, that a poem was a shared breath between writer and reader. She then asked Maya to memorize one poem and come back to recite it, not just with her lips, but with her heart. Maya clutched the book to her chest, feeling its weight, and walked home through the dusky evening. The crickets sang, but they could not match the echo of that request, which asked her to find her voice again. Maya returned to the garden many times, finding a bench beneath a magnolia tree whose broad, glossy leaves formed a canopy of green. She would sit there, the book open in her lap, whispering the lines of the poem to the bees and the blossoms. At first, her voice was barely a murmur, a shape of air that trembled and fled. But day by day, the words grew stronger. The perfume of magnolia blossoms mixed with the earthy smell of damp soil, and ladybugs crawled slowly over her hand. She began to understand that her voice was not lost. It had only been waiting, curled up like a fiddlehead fern, for the right season to unfold. The afternoon finally came when Maya stood before Mrs. Flowers and recited the poem without faltering. Her voice was soft, but clear, each word a stepping stone back to herself. Mrs. Flowers smiled, a deep, quiet smile that said more than applause ever could. That evening, Maya sat on the porch of the store and watched the sun set the cotton fields on fire with its golden light. She felt something open inside her, like a window after a long rain. She still had many quiet days ahead, but the silence had lost its power. She had learned that words, gently spoken, could mend what had been broken. At 13, Maya's world changed again. She traveled west by train, crossing the wide, arid plains until she reached the edge of the continent, a city of hills and water called San Francisco. The train pulled into the ferry building at dusk, and the air that greeted her was cool and salty, a strange caress after the thick heat of Arkansas. The sky was a soft wash of lavender and rose, and the dark silhouette of the Golden Gate Bridge seemed to float in the mist like a giant, gentle harp. Maya stepped onto the platform with a single suitcase, her heart beating with both fear and wonder at the vastness of the sea. Her mother, Vivian Baxter, was a woman of dazzling energy and independence, so different from the quiet dignity of Mama. Vivian lived in a sprawling house in the Fillmore district with windows that opened to a view of the bay. In the mornings, Maya would stand at the window and watch the ferries glide across the gray-blue water, their white trails fading into the fog. The scent of eucalyptus and roasting coffee mingled with the ocean breeze. Vivian gave Maya a room of her own, a space painted in pale yellow, where she could sit and listen to the foghorns call out through the night like sleepy whales. Maya was enrolled at George Washington High School, a great brick building on a hill, but her true education happened after school at the California Labor School. There, she studied dance and drama, her body learning a new language of movement. The studio was a bright room with a polished wooden floor that reflected the soft glow of dusty stage lights. A worn upright piano stood in the corner, and an old pianist played Chopin while young dancers practiced plies. Maya felt her muscles stretch and strengthen. She discovered that her body could express what words could not. In that space, she began to find a rhythm that matched the pulse of the city. At the age of 16, driven by her own fierce desire for independence, Maya set out to become a streetcar conductor. She visited the Market Street Railway office day after day until she was finally hired, making her the first Black woman to hold that position in San Francisco. In the early mornings, before the sun crested the East Bay Hills, she would climb aboard the cable car, its polished brass fixtures gleaming in the dim light. She pulled the cord that clanged the bell, and the car lurched forward. The city was quiet then, only the sound of wheels on tracks and the distant cry of gulls. She wore a neat blue uniform and a conductor's cap, and as she collected fares, she felt a deep, steady pride. During her senior year of high school, Maya gave birth to a son, whom she named Guy. She was just 17, a single mother in a city that never slowed, yet she poured all her tenderness into that small, warm child. In the afternoons, she would push the baby carriage down to the park by the bay, where the wind ruffled his soft hair. She pointed to the ships and named their colors, and he gurgled in response. The sound of the foghorns became a lullaby for them both. Late at night, while Guy slept, she would write poems on scraps of paper, her heart full of both fear and fierce hope. As she grew into young womanhood, Maya began to perform. She danced in small clubs around the Fillmore, where the music poured out onto the sidewalk and mixed with the scent of fried shrimp and spicy sauce. The stage was tiny, the blue spotlight warm as a hand on her shoulder. When she moved to the rhythm, she shed her old shyness like a cocoon. She adopted the name Maya Angelou, combining a childhood nickname with a variation of her ex-husband's surname. Under that new name, she felt reborn, a dancer, a singer, a storyteller. After the shows, she would walk home through the quiet streets, the fog softening every street lamp into a fuzzy golden globe. In a small theater on a side street, she gave her first public poetry reading. The room was intimate, filled with friends and strangers who had come to hear the young woman with the rich, deep voice. Maya stood at the microphone, the pages trembling slightly in her hand, and then she began to speak. The words flowed, not as a whisper, but as a full river, carrying images of the South and the sea. She heard her own voice resonate in the space, and a strange, calm joy settled over her. That night, she knew that she was not only reclaiming her voice, but offering it to others, a gift that had been incubated in silence and bloomed in the California light. As the years passed, San Francisco remained her touchstone. She would often walk to the end of the pier at dusk, watching the fog roll under the Golden Gate like a slow, silent tide. The hills of the city glowed with scattered lights, and the bay lay flat and silver in the twilight. A single fishing boat chugged homeward, its lantern swinging gently. Maya breathed in the salt air and felt the presence of all the lives she had lived: the girl in the store, the silent child, the conductor, the dancer, the mother. In that moment, her heart was as wide as the Pacific, and she was ready for whatever journey lay beyond the horizon. In her mid-20s, Maya's love for performance carried her across the Atlantic. She joined the international touring company of Porgy and Bess, the great American opera, as a singer and dancer. For nearly 2 years, she traveled through Europe by train, passing snow-capped Alps and vineyards that glowed amber in the autumn sun. She walked the cobbled streets of Rome at dawn, the sound of church bells echoing off ancient stones, and stood in awe before the Colosseum bathed in the pale pink light of early morning. The world opened before her like a richly illustrated book, and she felt the thrill of being a citizen not of one nation, but of the whole earth. The theaters where they performed were palaces of velvet and gold, built in another century. Before the curtain rose, the air was thick with the scent of dust and perfume, and the audience murmured in a dozen languages. In the wings, Maya would stand very still, listening to the orchestra tune its instruments. When the music began, her voice joined the chorus, deep and resonant. She sang the story of Catfish Row night after night, carrying the sorrow and hope of a community far from its origins. She also danced, her body moving like a ripple of wind through wheat, and she felt that each performance was an act of translation of pain into beauty, of silence into song. When the tour concluded, Maya chose not to return to America. She moved to Cairo with her husband, a South African freedom fighter named Vusumzimek. The city embraced her with its own kind of music, the call of the muezzin floating from minarets at twilight, the clatter of donkey carts, the perfume of cardamom and jasmine in the Khan el-Khalili Bazaar. Maya worked as an editor for the English-language newspaper The Arab Observer, writing stories about a world in flux. In the evenings, she would sit on her balcony overlooking the Nile, the river a dark ribbon beneath a copper sky, and listen to the distant hum of a city that had been a crossroads for millennia. After a few years, a new dream pulled her further south to Ghana, the first Black African nation to gain independence. She arrived in Accra during a time of hope, when Pan-Africanism was a living flame. The earth was a deep, warm red, and palm trees lined the shore where the Atlantic Ocean sighed against the sand. Maya taught at the University of Ghana's School of Music and Drama, her students eager and bright. She lived in a simple whitewashed bungalow with a bougainvillea vine climbing the wall. In the morning, she would brew tea and watch the fishermen launch their long wooden boats into the surf, their voices rising in a chant as old as the sea. As a journalist for the Ghanaian Times and a radio broadcaster, Maya wrote about the emerging Africa, interviewing artists and diplomats, always with a tape recorder in her bag. But her deepest pleasure was the act of writing itself. She would sit on her shaded veranda with a notebook, while the Atlantic breeze carried the scent of salt and frangipani. The scratching of her pen was the only sound above the drone of insects. She wrote about her childhood, about the road she had traveled, shaping fragments of memory into something whole. The midday heat pressed down like a gentle hand, and she worked until the sun dipped low, the sky turning watermelon pink. It was in Accra that she met Malcolm X. He had come to Africa to build ties between the struggle at home and the newly independent nations. One evening, they walked together along the beach as the sun dropped into the sea, a great orange disk melting into the water. The waves lapped quietly at their feet, and Malcolm spoke about the necessity of dignity and the power of self-definition. Maya listened, the salt wind lifting her scarf, nodding as his words aligned with her own beliefs. She felt a profound connection to the continent that had sheltered her, but she knew her work awaited across the ocean. In 1965, Maya returned to the United States to help Malcolm build the Organization of Afro-American Unity. But only a few weeks later, he was assassinated. The news fell like a sudden winter, and she mourned in a deep, private stillness. In her grief, she found a new purpose when she was invited to work with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. She became the Northern Coordinator for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, organizing quietly behind the scenes. She would spend her days in a small church office in Harlem, where the afternoon light streamed through stained glass windows, painting the wooden floor in jewel tones of blue and crimson. There, the work was not the roar of crowds, but the steady rhythm of planning, the soft rustle of papers, the murmur of prayer. On April 4, 1968, Dr. King was killed. That day was also Maya's 40th birthday. The weight of the news crushed her, and she withdrew from public life. She sat for weeks in a darkened room, unable to write. Then her friend James Baldwin took her by the hand and led her to a dinner party, where she told stories of her childhood and everyone listened, spellbound. An editor present challenged her to write an autobiography as literature. She remembered the caged bird from Dunbar's poem, and soon she began to write at a plain wooden desk by a window, a single candle burning. The flame flickered, and her pen began to move across the page, tracing the shape of a life that had survived so much. With Baldwin's encouragement, Maya accepted the formidable task of writing her life. She chose to go to London, renting a small, quiet flat on a narrow street where the only sounds were the distant chime of church bells and the occasional rumble of a black taxi. Outside her window, a tiny garden lay tangled with roses, and the perpetual gray light of an English autumn filtered in like a gentle whisper. She set up a plain pine desk facing the window, a stack of clean paper beside her old typewriter. The cold air smelled of moist leaves and chimney smoke, and the city seemed to hold its breath, offering her the space to remember. Each morning, she rose before the first gray light. She would brew a pot of strong coffee in the tiny kitchenette, the bitter aroma filling the flat, and then settle herself at the desk. Her fingers would rest on the keys, and she would stare out at the sleeping street. Eventually, a bird would begin to sing in the garden, a small, brave robin whose song cut through the silence. That became her signal. As the bird wove its melody, Maya's fingers began to move. The typewriter's gentle clack was a comforting rhythm, a heartbeat of creation. In those early hours, she mined the caverns of her memory, bringing up nuggets of gold and stone. She wrote of stamps, not in grand sweeping statements, but in the particular smell of the store's molasses barrel and the exact shade of Mama's starched apron. She described the way the cotton fields shivered under a noonday sun and the soft creak of the porch swing at dusk. The words came slowly. Some days, she spent hours on a single sentence, searching for the precise note that would ring true. The caged bird of Dunbar's poem became her silent companion, a symbol of the spirit that cannot be silenced, even when its bars are made of trauma and injustice. She allowed herself to cry when the memories grew too sharp, then she would dry her eyes and continue. When the weight of the past grew heavy, she would place a cloth over the typewriter and step outside. She walked to a small park nearby, where plane trees shed their bark in curls and an old iron fountain trickled water, the surface rippling with the movement of tiny fish. She would sit on a bench and toss crumbs to the pigeons, watching their iridescent necks bob in the pale light. The damp, earthy smell of the London park soothed her, and the sight of children bundled in wool coats playing tag reminded her that life insisted on moving forward. After half an hour, she would return to the flat, her mind cleared, and the next sentence would be waiting for her. As the seasons turned and spring began to bud, the bird in the garden was joined by a mate. Now 2 robins sang in the morning, their duet bright and insistent. Maya interpreted their song as encouragement. She was crafting a character of herself, a young girl named Marguerite who became Maya, and she poured into that character all the nuance of real experience, the fear, the wonder, the rebellion, the love. She wrote about the cage of racism, the cage of silence, but also about the singing that never stopped. Sometimes, she would pause and listen to the birds, and a small smile would cross her face, knowing that her own caged bird was finally singing on the page. Months passed, and the stack of typed pages grew thick. One evening, she typed the final sentence and sat back in her chair. The flat was dark except for the small desk lamp, and the silence seemed to hold its breath. She read the last paragraph aloud, her voice soft in the empty room, and then she wept, not from sorrow, but from release. The next morning, she carefully wrapped the manuscript in brown paper and walked to the post office, its weight solid in her arms. Sending it to her publisher felt like releasing a bird from its cage, surrendering it to the wide, unpredictable air. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings was published in 1969, and the world took notice. Critics praised the lyrical beauty of its prose, its unflinching honesty, and its triumph of spirit. Maya received letters from strangers, many of them women, who saw their own hidden stories reflected in hers. One quiet afternoon, she sat in a rocking chair by the window of her new apartment in New York, reading a review that called her a major new literary voice. The afternoon sun slanted through the blinds, striping the floor in gold. She folded the newspaper, feeling not pride but a deep, quiet gratitude. Her long silence had finally become a song that others could hear and be healed by. In the following years, as she looked back on that period of creation, Maya often returned to the image of the bird. She would sit by her window, watching sparrows dart among the branches of a maple tree, and she understood that the cage was never a permanent thing. The act of writing had set her free, not only from the past, but from fear itself. She would continue to write, to speak, to rise. Her caged bird had sung, and the melody would echo for generations. Outside, a robin tilted its head and offered a final trill, as if to confirm that the story was only beginning. The success of I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings opened door after door, and Maya walked through them with grace. She continued to write, producing 5 more autobiographies, poetry collections like And Still I Rise, and essays that became touchstones of wisdom. She settled in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, buying a large Victorian house painted a warm yellow, with a wraparound porch and a magnolia tree in the front yard. Inside, the walls were covered with African art and paintings by friends, and the shelves held thousands of books. The house became a home where she could look out through lace curtains and see the seasons turning gently over the southern land that had shaped her. At Wake Forest University, she became the Reynolds Professor of American Studies, a title she wore lightly. Her classroom was an intimate room, with chairs arranged in a circle so that every student's face caught the afternoon light. She taught not from a podium, but from a soft armchair, her voice a low, melodic instrument. She would read aloud from the works of Shakespeare and Francis Harper, drawing out the music in the words. Her students, a mix of black and white, quiet and outspoken, learned that poetry was not a riddle but a breath, a heartbeat. In the evenings, she would often walk across the dew-damp campus, her figure a silhouette against the red brick buildings, carrying a satchel of their essays. Her home in Winston-Salem was never truly quiet, for she loved to fill it with friends, family, and the aromas of her cooking. Maya was a magnificent cook, and her kitchen was a place of slow-simmered greens, buttermilk cornbread, and the pungent sweetness of caramelized onions. She would stand at the stove, stirring a pot of red beans, while a pot of jasmine rice steamed on the back burner. Laughter wrapped around the dining table like a warm shawl, and after the meal, she might recite a poem or tell a story from her travels. The candle flames mirrored the sparkle in her eyes, and these gatherings were her way of weaving community, of reminding everyone that the table was an altar of fellowship. On the morning of January 20th, 1993, a crisp winter clarity gripped Washington, D.C. Maya stood on the west front of the United States Capitol, the great dome rising behind her like a silent guardian. A vast sea of faces stretched to the Washington Monument, and the air was so cold that her breath formed tiny clouds. She wore a long purple coat and a strand of pearls, and in her hands she held the poem she had been asked to compose for the inauguration of President Bill Clinton. The silence before she spoke was immense, an expectant hush that held the collective hope of a nation ready for a new chapter. She began to recite on the pulse of morning, her voice deep and resonant, carrying across the crowd like a bell. She spoke of the rock, the river, and the tree, symbols that summoned a shared ancestry and a call to unity. She named creatures and continents, and she asked every listener to lift up their faces and greet the new day with courage. As the words flowed, many in the audience wept, and millions more watched on television, their living rooms suddenly filled with a profound stillness. When she finished, the applause rolled like thunder, but Maya simply nodded, her expression serene, as if the poem had always been there, waiting for her to set it free. With the world now knowing her face and voice, Maya could have traveled endlessly, but she always returned to her garden. Behind her yellow house, a winding path led to a magnolia tree she had planted herself. In spring, its large, creamy blossoms opened like cupped hands, releasing a lemon-sweet fragrance that drifted through the neighborhood. She placed a stone bench beneath its branches, and in the late afternoons she would sit there with a notebook, jotting down lines of poetry or simply watching the bees move from flower to flower. The deep green leaves formed a canopy of shade, and the rustle of the wind became her only companion. Honors accumulated over the years, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the National Medal of Arts, and more than 50 honorary degrees, but Maya kept them in soft perspective. Her greatest pride, she often said, was that she had raised her son, loved her family, and told the truth on the page. In her study, she surrounded herself with framed photographs of her grandmother Mama, her brother Bailey, her son Guy, and the many friends who had walked beside her. The evening light would spill through the tall window, illuminating the silver frames, and she would sit quietly remembering. The click of the grandfather clock was the only sound, marking time like a gentle metronome. In the final years of her long life, Maya still rose before the sun. She would make tea and stand at the kitchen window, watching the dawn turn from indigo to rose. The birds began their chorus, and she smiled, for she had never stopped loving their music. She died peacefully in her sleep in May 2014, at 86, in her own bed, with her son and grandchildren nearby, the house filled with the quiet hum of memory. Those who loved her imagined her not as a caged bird, but as a great eagle riding a warm thermal into the sunset. The garden endured, and the magnolia bloomed once more, a silent, fragrant testament to a life that rose and rose again.